He's back just when you thought it was safe to get into the water, just when you thought that he might be sated with the £12 million donation from the barbaric medieval House of Al Saud. Tony Blair is back with the British media sprawled at his feet, waiting on his every word, failing to ask him any serious question. He was back out today in a tour of the horizon to let us know what he thinks on, well, more or less everything, but especially the Labour Party and its leader, Jeremy Corbyn. He wasn't asked, so I'll make the point. How is it, Mr. Blair, that this man, who is an, quote, existential threat to the existence of the British Labour Party, unquote, is capital F-O-U-R, 4 points ahead of the Conservative Party in the national opinion polls, in the latest of which, from the only polling company that correctly predicted the outcome of last year's general election, gives Jeremy Corbyn pole position. He's bookies' favourite, 4-1, to be Britain's next Prime Minister. Yet, to listen to Tony Blair, you'd think that Labour was, down at 29%. In the national opinion polls, which was where it was when Jeremy Corbyn took over as leader. You'd think, wouldn't you, listening to Tony Blair, that the Labour Party's membership would be 2/3 smaller than it is today, because that's where it was when Jeremy Corbyn took over. He has tripled the Labour Party's membership, making it bigger than every other party in Britain put together, making it the biggest left-of-centre party in Europe, and lifting its vote by a higher percentage than Labour has ever achieved since the 1945 landslide against Winston Churchill. According to Mr. Blair, he doesn't know that the Labour Party can be brought back to people like him. Well, at least that is some sign of sense. Let me tell you, you needn't look any further, Mr. Blair. The Labour Party is never coming back to people like you and your dismal acolytes, most of whom would, if you asked them to, polish your shoes, but who can see only you in the reflection. A Blair Tribute Act would be the new breakaway party, which is, it's clear, this weekend, very close to launch. I say so because this week was significant not just for Mr. Blair's démarche, in which he said, incidentally, that Britain, he speaks for Britain, you see, Britain will not accept a choice between Boris Johnson and Jeremy Corbyn at the next general election. Having divined what Britain will or will not accept, Mr. Blair makes clear that, and I quote, a moderate centrist party will come in between them, will fill the gap left by both. I don't know if you knew, but Sir Vince Cable is the leader of the Liberal Democrats. You could not get more moderate and centrist than them. You could not get more anti-Brexit than them. In fact, moderate centrist anti-Brexism is them. They're currently standing in the opinion poll aforementioned at 6%. Now, I don't know why all these people, the Chuka Umunas, the Joan Ryans, the Shookers, the Manns, the Jess Phillipses and so on, why they don't just join the Liberal Democrats. At least they've already got an office. Not got much else, but they've got an office. And people know their name. a new party trying to occupy the same political space as them seems to me at least a duplication of effort. But hey, what do I know? Now, Sir Vince is apparently getting ready to quit. But as they said on the death of President Calvin Coolidge, how could you tell? He has driven the Liberal Democrat cause up a cul-de-sac. Tony Blair and his friends are determined to supplant them in what they define as the centre of British politics. But it's not just the Blair speech. It's the votes of no confidence in not one but two of Mr. Corbyn's most rebarbative enemies in their constituency Labour parties last evening. Joan Ryan in Enfield, who then described her own members who had expressed their no confidence in her as trots, Stalinists and communists, appearing not to know the rather substantial difference between these three things. And Mr. Schuker in Luton had the same fate on the same evening. His party members have lost confidence in him too. It seems to me that notwithstanding the backsliding of the Labour Party's National Executive Committee, and even some of those formerly imagined to be close to Jeremy Corbyn, people like John Landsman of Momentum, people like John MacDonald, for now anyway, the shadow chancellor of the Labour Party, despite their backsliding, that the members themselves are taking matters into their own hands. And the threat of normal selection, because that's what it should be called. Before every election, you have to be picked again to be the Labour Party's candidate in that election. The threat of that, never mind the actuality, is going to stampede Dan Hodges' famous 12 to 20, though last week he said maybe more than 20 now, and I agree with him on that, out of Labour and into something else. We'll be exploring that with Dan in the show this evening. We'll also be looking at Boris Johnson. His latest divorce, Dan Wootton here earlier said, was unlikely to damage him. Well, it's not impossible that that will be so. Things have changed. Divorces come and go. That's true. But Boris Johnson's private life makes James Bond's look like a Boy Scout leader. Boris Johnson's private life is so colourful as to be, well, lurid. And we will have a choice between the amoral Mr. Johnson and the highly moral Mr. Corbyn at the next general election. Whether Tony Blair likes it or not, that will be the choice before the British people at the next general election. And I'm not so sure that Mr. Johnson's lifestyle, how shall I put it, will not hold him back in that election. We'll see. Apparently he's upbeat about the divorce. His wife's getting the house, the car, the kids, the hi-fi, the dog, the cat, the record collection, and almost all of his money. But he gets to keep a blue British passport. We'll be looking at the Boris Johnson story too. But I suspect the story which will dominate the show this evening, at least as far as the callers are concerned, the latest development in the Skripal affair, the Salisbury affair, the Novichok affair. With careful timing, the first Monday back in Parliament so she could make a grandstanding speech, the police have suddenly decided to release the mugshots of the two prime suspects. In fact, it turns out they've known of these two suspects since May. We know that because the police searched the flea pit in the East End of London, where these two mugs, in the mugshots, shared a room with a double bed. I mean, things in the GRU ain't what they used to be. Expenses must be way down. No wonder Sergei Skripal called it a day there. They shared a room in a flea pit in the East End of London. We know that because the police raided it in May without telling the owner why. And the owner learned from the media this week that they had found traces of Novichok in their hotel bedroom. Nobody told the owner. More importantly, nobody told all the guests that have slept in that bedroom every day ever since. Nobody told the cleaners that have had to clean it ever since, every day. So these men were identified in May. But in September, their pictures were published prior to Mrs. May's statement in the House of Commons, and people were asked to come forward if they'd seen these men. You might think that it might have been better and more effective to publish these mugshots as soon as they'd identified these men, when people's memories, might have been a little bit fresher. People who've stayed in the flea pit in the East End of London are being asked, did you see these men in a hotel 6 months ago? When they could have been asked when their memories were rather more fresh. But that, I'm afraid, dear listener, is the least of it. A number of important points arise, and I'll be discussing this in a minute with counter-terrorism intelligence officer, former Scotland Yard policeman and lawyer Charles Shoebridge. But let me, as it were, lay out my stall. The thesis that the Novichok, if that is what it was painted on the doorknob of the Skripals, died this week. You wouldn't think it from listening to or reading the mainstream media, but then that's what this show is for, to set the record straight. You see, the Skripals left that doorknob for the final time in their lives at 9:15 on the morning of Sunday, the 4th of March. But the assassins didn't arrive in Salisbury until 11:48 a.m. That is more than 2 hours, well over 2 hours, after the Skripals left the house for the first time, which means that everything that you have read, that these people were affected from their doorknob, is false. That in itself raises a number of important questions. Why have the police erected a whole array of tents outside the Skripal house this day? Why did the taxpayer buy the house from the Skripals, presumably with a view at some point of knocking it down? Thirdly, how did D.S. Bailey get affected? Because he couldn't have got affected off the doorknob. He couldn't have got affected at the Skripal house unless the Novichok was in the Skripal house. And that's where my now working hypothesis comes in. I don't know who these two mugs are, but I'm going to come to that in a minute. But I don't doubt for 1 minute that they are involved in this extraordinary story. It's my working hypothesis that they came to Salisbury on the Saturday and the Sunday not to paint the doorknob of the Skripals, but to meet the Skripals. And in that 4 hours, when both Sergei and Yulia's phones were simultaneously switched off, I believe that was to avoid surveillance of that meeting. Now, something went wrong at that meeting. The Skripals may very well have leaked Novichok upon themselves, or the mugs may have sprayed it on them. A second batch of Novichok has to be a second batch, by the way, because the perfume bottle in the charity skip picked up by Charlie Rowley and which killed poor Don Sturgis was sealed in cellophane. We know that because Charlie had to cut it open. So there's two batches of Novichok, but neither of them was painted on the Skripals doorknob. Forget that. Because at 9:15, the Skripals' car was seen on Churchill Road and several other roads heading into town, into Salisbury, and never seen, ever seen, coming back again. Now, there are other oddities, of course. We're asked to believe that these two mugs, at midday, noon, when everyone was coming back from church, cutting their grass, washing their cars, playing in their gardens, walking around the streets, chose noon, midday, to approach the Skripal house and paint their doorknob with the deadliest nerve agent known to man, 8 to 10 times more deadly than VX, our own invention, by the way, I remind you. Now, given that they'd been there the previous afternoon, why would they come back at midday in broad daylight to paint the Skripals' doorknob? What if somebody saw them? What if CCTV saw them doing it? What if Skripal was at home and answered the door or looked through the curtains? Think about it. Don't be silly. Think about it. If you'd gone to Salisbury the day before, you would have waited till it was dark, and then you would have carried out this potentially deadly assassination. The last time, the worst time to do it would be midday on a Sunday afternoon. But we know now that they couldn't have done that. So what were they in Salisbury for? Why were the Skripals' phones off for 4 hours? Each of them, both of their phones, switched off at the same moment, switched back on at the same moment. Now lastly, who are these mugs? Well, Mrs. May is very clear. They're not just Russians. They're operatives of the Russian GRU. Note to editors, the GRU was actually abolished 10 years ago. It doesn't exist. So stop saying it. Stop describing the GRU as a fearsomely effective intelligence service with a tight chain of command, because it actually no longer exists. Yeah, you get that? Mrs. May was clear, though. They're GRU intelligence officers, and they're Russians. Well, I don't know if they are Russians, and neither do you. But the British Embassy in Moscow took their fingerprints, took their eyeball prints, took every detail, a 10-page visa application document, every detail about them. But they haven't published a single word of it. They haven't given us the patronymics. They haven't given us the address that was submitted, the occupations claimed. They haven't given us anything from the visa applications. The police, unbelievably, answered the question, what kind of visa were these men travelling on? Was it a tourist visa? This was from the BBC, by the way. The BBC asked, what kind of visa were these men travelling on? A business visa? A tourist visa? A student visa? What kind of visa? And the police answered, we don't know. How can you not know? The British Embassy in Moscow gave them the visa. So how can you not know? 6 months after this dastardly crime was committed. Now, I don't know if they're Russians. I don't know if they're Russian intelligence officers. As I've said from the beginning, they could be. They could just be Russians. They could be Russians who are criminals. They could be Russians who are servants of the oligarchs who fled Russia, stole its money, and moved to London. Or they could be Ukrainians. They could be anything. Nothing you know proves that they're Russians, still less that they're Russian intelligence operatives. I close with this. If the British are serious about this, they will submit these visa application forms to the police in Moscow and ask them to search for these men. The fact that the British have not and have no intention of doing so tells you quite a lot, don't you think? It's the mother of all talk shows.